that should be usable. It should be possible to apply this validation tool to any other model, not just the model of culture. It should also work with models like the Big Five personality model, any other model. So the highlights that should be study is that usable, it's subjective culture, it should be the mind, and objective culture, objectively measurable behaviors, such as corruption, educational achievement, homicide rates, suicide rates, all these national indicators. They produce mirror images. They produce the same dimensions. Both types of culture are patterned geographically. This is in black because this is not a novelty. What is red is new or relatively new. What is black is not. It's well known that culture is patterned geographically. Nations that are close to each other, like Canada and the United States, Germany and Austria and Switzerland, have similar or somewhat similar cultures. If they're far away, they do not have similar cultures. And by the way, this is one of the issues that I spotted a long time ago with the Hofstede model. If you plot masculinity and uncertainty avoidance, you see some improbable pairs of countries. You see, for example, that Canada is relatively close to Hong Kong and India and Taiwan, and you will probably wonder, what does Canada have to do with Hong Kong, except that Michael Bond lives there? I don't see any other similarity, which is a red flag. That's a red flag. If countries that are close together are not close together on a cultural map, or vice versa. But we also decided to apply this test to data from the United States. And we found that the world and the US, the 50 states, exhibit the same cultural patterns, which I'm going to show. This means that nations and US states are valid units of cultural analysis. We're not the first ones who analyzed culture across US states, but our study validates this approach. And then I would argue that 2 dimensions of culture are enough to capture the most important cultural variation across the modern world and across the US states. Across Europe, probably 1 dimension is enough. And then flexibility monumentalism, which is a modification of this extremely important dimension of culture that Michael Bond discovered many decades ago. He called it Confucian dynamism, and later Hofstede called it long-term orientation. And I renamed it once again, flexibility monumentalism. I will explain why. It's compatible with life history strategy theory, which I will also explain briefly. And finally, apart from level of economic development, climate variance today. These are the highlights, and these are also the conclusions. My last slide is similar to this one. Okay. It all started with this study by Barty and Schwartz from 2003, in which they validate Schwartz's individual level model. I guess that all of you, or at least most of you, are familiar with his famous circumplex or pizza. It looks like a pizza, in which slices that are close to each other are correlated. Value 1 is close to value 2, which means that they're correlated. In that study, they show that if you analyze practices related to those values, you get exactly the same circumplex. Value 1 corresponds to practice 1, so I have them in the same color. And value 2 corresponds to practice 2. And the structure of the values is exactly the same as the structure of the practices. They give you the same circumflex with the same arrangement. So the subjective values model is the same as the objective practices model. And I thought, aha, can we show something similar at the national level? So this brings up a fundamental question. How do we validate a model of culture or anything else? First, as I said, it should produce clear geo-economic patterns. The dimensions should have predictive properties. They should be related closely to important external variables, practices in this case. It should be replicable. It should be extractable from different monumentalism, which is, this is a basic principle of science, replicability. Number 4 is not exactly scientific, but this is based on my experience with students. They often ask if my country scores high on a particular dimension, is there any evidence, any visible that this is so? So some ideographic evidence based on observation could be helpful for teaching purposes mostly. And then number 5 and number 6 are in a bigger font because this is the novelty in this study, that subjective culture, mental software, should mirror or be structured like objective culture behaviors. And finally, national patterns should replicate across other ecological units of analysis, such as US states, to address this concern that nations may not be an adequate unit of analysis because there's so much variation at a subnational level. This is true, but I have a couple of articles published already and a couple of articles with Anneli Casa and one with Chris Welzel, in which we show that subnational units tend to cluster along the lines of nations. They tend to form national clusters, which justifies the use of nations as units of analysis. But this is another way to justify the use of nations. If we find that culture has the same structure across nations and across subnational units, this is a strong argument for the use of both as units of analysis. The US happens to be a highly developed country and they have reliable statistics for almost everything at the state level. So it's easy to test this hypothesis that culture across the US states has the same structure as across nations. This visualizes how a single factor or a single dimension was validated. You have a factor defined by a couple of variables of subjective culture. You ask people something, you ask them to describe themselves, and then you try to find linkages to something objective. So P1 is a practice, P2 is another practice, P3 is a third practice. You try to find strong correlations between this dimension of subjective culture and something more objective, such as road death tolls, homicide rates, whatever can be measured more or less objectively. Now we propose a new validation test. For each factor of subjective culture, defined by V1, V2, V3, V4, there should be a mirror factor of objective culture, defined by practice 1, practice 2, practice 3, practice 4. Here's an example. If there is a factor called conservatism, consisting of conservative values and beliefs at the national level, such as religion is very important, and men are seen as more capable than women. These are examples from the World Value Survey. Then there should be a factor consisting of conservative practices. It should be possible, and it is possible, to measure church or mosque attendance and gender income gap. And they should define the same factor of practices, and the two factors should be strongly correlated. So this is an example of what we mean by mirror images of subjective and objective culture. What is in the software of the mind should have a mirror image expressed in terms of behaviors at the national level and at the level of US states or other subnational units. But there's a caveat here. The fact that we found this similarity between US states and nations does not mean that you will find this within any other nation. The US is huge. The US has a lot of cultural variety. So it's possible that a smaller nation may not yield the same patterns if it doesn't have enough cultural variety. And the data for subjective culture for this study come from this 2014-2016 so-called Hofstede project that was launched by Mediacom, a big international company, and Hofstede Insights, a consulting company. The samples are almost nationally representative. They are, except that they're slightly skewed toward the university-educated populations in the developed countries. Okay, so I continue. The goals of the project were, the main goal was to reveal and explain differences along the world's south-north axis, because even before the project, I suspected that this is the individualism-collectivism axis. And then the other axis is the west-east axis. Similar at the national level. I suspected that this is the long-term orientation axis, and this project confirmed it. This is the cultural map that the project yielded. The north-south axis is indeed the individualism-collectivism axis. At the top, you see North Europe and Anglo countries, the most individualist. At the bottom, Africa and South Asia and the Arab world, although we have only one Arab country, only Egypt. These are the most collectivist. In this particular study, the Netherlands happens to be the most collectivist, but it may be a fluke. It may be Sweden or Denmark. What matters is that it's Northwestern Europe. It's not the Anglo world. It's the Scandinavian countries and the Netherlands that are the most individualist. And the most collectivist are those of Africa, tropical Latin America, and South Asia. So the correlation with latitude is very obvious. And then the horizontal dimension discovered by Michael Bond, which I call monumentalism flexibility. I will explain why and why it's an extremely important dimension of culture. Now look at the real cultural map, and this is more or less what happens when you plot individualism, collectivism, and monumentalism flexibility on this map. And if you ask me why the monumentalism flexibility axis is curved, the answer is that it should probably be even more curved. I wanted to visualize the fact that the most flexible societies, the most long-term oriented, are those of East Asia, followed by Russia and Northeastern Europe, Finland, and later we found that Estonia is also there, which is also reflected in the most important implication of this dimension, educational achievement. It's always East Asia, followed by Estonia, Finland, and Russia. And the countries with the highest monumentalism score are always at the bottom, even if you control for national wealth. This is one of the most important implications of this dimension, but it's not the only one. Now, recently, Fogg analyzed during the existing literature, and he came to the conclusion that all valid and validated dimensions in them can be subsumed under a two-dimensional model that is almost the same as this two-dimensional model that I'm presenting. But he wondered if flexibility monumentalism is something substantial or mostly response style. I'll come back to this. Now, you're all familiar with this cultural map, and lo and behold, it's very similar to my map, even though the two perspectives, the two theoretical perspectives, the two databases, everything in these studies is extremely different. And still what you see is individualism, collectivism. This is well known. There are studies that demonstrate this, that the axis of individualism, collectivism on this map goes from the so-called Protestant Europe. It has nothing to do with Protestantism. It has to do with climate. It has to do with dairy farming, as I will explain later. But it is Northwestern Europe versus Africa and the Arab world and tropical Latin America. It's exactly the same as in my database. And then the flexibility monumentalism axis is East Asia versus Latin America and Africa. Of course, this is based on Impressionism, but here you see the correlations. Flexibility monumentalism is correlated with the latest scores for traditional rational at 0.77, not at all with expression survival, whereas individualism collectivism, my individualism collectivism measure, is correlated with both. And that makes sense because it's the diagonal between the two, between traditional rational and expression survival. So it's a matter of rotation. You can slightly rotate these dimensions of Engelhard-Belzel, and you will get an even better alignment with flexibility, monumentalism, individualism, collectivism. So ultimately, I would argue that these are two sister models, and they explain almost everything interesting that there is to explain at the level of nations. And I would also argue at the level of US states, and I will show what this is. Now, the south-north dimension, collectivism, individualism, is very well known. Three main facets. They all have almost exact equivalents in Schwartz's theory, high conformism. Schwartz calls this embeddedness in the collectivist world. Desire for what I call social ascendancy. Schwartz calls this hierarchy. Importance of fame, success, power, all this is well known. And the third one is exclusionism versus universalism, treating people on the basis of their group affiliation versus treating people in a universal way. This term universalism is borrowed by Schwartz. Again, he also uses this term universalism, but he also speaks of egalitarianism, which is typical of the individualist Northwest Europe. The next dimension is less known. This is a reinterpretation of what Michael Bond initially found and Hofstadter's theory. My reinterpretation is based on Steve Heine's theory. It's an individual level theory about self-stability and self-esteem or self-enhancement. He finds that individuals who have a strong self-opinion, strong self-esteem, tend to believe that they have an immutable self. Their self is invariant. And this makes sense because if you're happy with yourself, you have a high opinion of yourself, you have no reason to wish to change. but if you have a low self-opinion, you're likely to wish to change. And I got in touch with him and told him that I see a parallel with this dimension, this Bond-Hofstede dimension. And he answered, I've never given much thought to Hofstede's dimension analyses, but it turned out that his theory makes very good sense at the national level. And this study showed that all these facets are correlated. Nations where the self is supposed to be stable are also nations where people tend to have high self-esteem, and help and generosity are very important. And that's how you gain high esteem. You help everybody, you have to be generous, and you have to help people, and this boosts your self-esteem. But it seems that this depresses the perceived need for self-improvement in Africa, tropical Latin America, and Arab world. In East Asia and Northwestern Europe, it's the other extreme. The human self is seen as not good enough by default, but since it's flexible and adaptable, it is assumed that it can change and improve. How? Through education, through making a strong investment in education at the individual level and the cultural level. And to be able to be successful in education, you need strong self-control. This is well known from individual studies, because kids want to play. They don't want to spend 8 to 10 hours a day studying like in East Asia. You need extremely strong self-control. All these things are correlated at the national level. So why do I call this dimension monumentalism versus flexibility? Because figuratively speaking, the self in monumentalist societies, Africa and the Middle East, is like a monolithic, solid, eternal, unchangeable monument. What you see here is a statue of Marcus Aurelius, a Roman emperor, and this statue is 2,000 years old. You can see it in the Capitolian Museum in Rome. It hasn't changed since then. Of course, this is an exaggeration because monumentalist cultures do change, but less fast than flexible cultures. The default personality in a flexible culture in East Asia is like a little changeable chameleon, modest, but believing in self-improvement. Now, for our study, we decided to validate this by producing a model of practices for which we had to pick some behavioral indicators, and we had two criteria. One, each behavioral indicator, each of these national statistics should be correlated with either individualism, collectivism, or flexibility, monumentalism, at least 0.60 across at least 40 countries. We tried to change these parameters, but we ended up with either too few countries or too weak correlations that are difficult to explain theoretically. So this seemed like the best parameters, 0.60 and 40 countries. And of course, there should be some explanation of each correlation in the existing literature. For example, this is a plot of collectivism, individualism, and corruption versus rule of law from Transparency International. The correlation is more than 0.60. It's close to 0.80. You see this, it's visualized perfectly, just like this one, collectivism, individualism versus the Human Development Index from 2015, because the measure of collectivism, individualism is also from 2015, 2016. It merges three types of equality or inequality: access to healthcare, access to education, access to, not access, but individual income, disparities in income. And you see the strong correlation with individualism, collectivism. In individualist societies, which are the richest ones, see Sweden, Norway, Germany, Finland, Switzerland, Netherlands, there is much more equality than in Africa. And then finally, collectivism, individualism versus social accident proneness. This is based on one of my studies in which I find that road death tolls, industrial fatalities, and airline safety form a single factor, which explains why in rich and individualist countries, road death tolls are much lower than in countries like Indonesia, Kenya, and Myanmar. And this is visible by the naked eye. You just go from the Netherlands to Indonesia, and even from Bulgaria into Indonesia. And you look at how people drive, and you will be horrified if this is your first time there. And this is reflected not just in observations, but in statistics. It is reflected in statistics. Now, what does this have to do with individualism, collectivism? First of all, it's strongly correlated with transparency versus corruption. In countries with a lot of corruption, there is less concern for road death tolls and industrial fatalities. Instead of charging fines, the police just collect a small bribe. Living in a country with quite a lot of corruption, like Bulgaria, I can tell you that all Bulgarians know this. You get caught for speeding by the police, you're likely to hear the police officer say, "What are we going to do now?" And this is an invitation. This means instead of fining you a heavy fine, I expect a small bribe, and you can drive away, and you can continue to speed until you kill somebody. So that's how it works. But there's there's a more direct correlation, I think, between collectivism and road death tolls. It's the sad fact that human life is less valuable in collectivist societies. Individualism is about human rights, the same human rights for everybody, including the most fundamental human right, which is the right to life and health. In collectivist societies, unfortunately, this conviction is less strong, that everybody has this universal human right. So there's less concern for safety. And finally, monumentalism, flexibility versus highest math achievement from TIMSS and PISA. You can do it also with average math achievement. You get exactly the same graph. You see East Asia, most flexible and highest achievement, followed by Russia, Finland. I don't know why I don't see. Yeah, Finland is also there. The Netherlands also has a good record in educational achievement. And recently, Estonia surpassed all other countries except East Asia in the latest, was it PISA or TIMSS, one of the latest studies, which is not surprising. It's in the same league, the same type of culture. Okay, so now we arrive at a hypothetical model of culture. For each factor of subjective culture, in blue, there should be a mirror factor or dimension of objective culture. I got this idea from my minuscule knowledge of astronomy. There is such a thing as binary stars, two stars gravitating around an invisible common center of gravity. And in this case, the center of gravity is culture. Culture is something invisible that keeps these two different factors, a subjective factor and an objective factor, together, gravitating around the same center of gravity. So this is the idea. For each subjective dimension, dimension of subjective culture, there should be a mirror image in objective culture practices. And what are these objective indicators? Those in pink that load on individualism, which we decided to call emancipation, to honor Chris Welzel's work, and also to distinguish between the subjective and the objective culture dimensions. And in this case, we're talking about objective dimensions. So the pink ones are well known from his work, from all kinds of other studies. Political freedom, transparency, corruption, gender inequality or equality load on the same factor. And road death tolls, for the reason that I explained, loads on the same factor. Innovation also loads on this factor, and there are studies that show that more individualist, richer countries have more innovation, because individualism is about thinking out of the box. So it makes sense. What about the yellow ones? This is less well known. Educational achievement and myopia prevalence load positively. Myopia prevalence, as some of you may know, is highest in East Asia, lowest in Africa. The data are from journals of ophthalmology that have studied these different levels of prevalence. And they, of course, myopia is partly or strongly heritable, it's genetic, but how much you read also contributes to myopia, according to these journals of ophthalmology. In one and the same country, people who live in cities, urban populations, have higher myopia rates than rural populations. Also, they find that myopia has been increasing and will continue to increase across the world as a function of more time spent reading. And specifically, they explain the high and growing myopia rates in East Asia as a function of the number of hours that children spend reading instead of playing outside, and hence the strong correlation between myopia and educational achievement. But what does this have to do with adolescent fertility, paternal presence at home, and homicide rates? All of these have been interpreted in terms of this theory that I mentioned, life history in social science. But by now you see publications using this theory in major journals, such as Nature Human Behavior and Journal of Personality and Social Psychology. It comes from biology and evolutionary science, but now it has become a mainstream theory in social science. And this is the best and shortest explanation that I have found. Slow life history strategies can be characterized by future-oriented attitudes, just like the Bond-Hofstede long-term orientation, a relatively long-term focus in behavioral strategies, for example, an ability to delay gratification. These strategies also involve higher paternal investment of time and effort in caring for offspring in a relatively small number of offspring. In contrast, fast life history strategies are characterized by the opposite, short-term focus and present-oriented attitude of taking risks, including, I open a parenthesis, including accepting the immediate rewards, which is the essence of crime, shortcut to success, to economic success, and prioritize mating efforts. This fast life history strategy makes sense in environments where life is short, such as Africa and tropical Latin America. If life is short, subconsciously people are aware of this, or consciously they're aware of this, which means that they have to start mating at a young age. Otherwise, if they wait, society will not reproduce. So adolescent fertility is a must in those societies. And trying to have as many children as possible is a must in those societies. And when this is a must, when men concentrate on having as many children with as many women as possible, and when this is the strategy, it is difficult and maybe even dysfunctional for men to invest strongly in a single child by a single woman or just a couple. This is the essence of a fast life history strategy. So what does life history strategy have to do with flexibility monumentalism? Both have to do with prioritization of short-term perspectives and goals versus long-term perspectives and goals, and following one's natural impulses versus self-control. Parents in monumentalist societies, such as Africa and Latin America, I can share this study with whoever is interested, teach their children to satisfy their desires, express their feelings, and, quote, be only yourself. Parents in flexible societies, East Asia, teach their children the opposite. Suppress your desires, hide your negative emotions, and be like those who know more. And this is the cultural map of the world based on behaviors. It is very similar to the previous one based on self-descriptions. So in this case, flexibility monumentalism is called short-term orientation versus long-term orientation, or fast life history strategy versus slow life history strategy. And you see the contrast between East Asia at one extreme, Europe, the Arab world, South Asia kind of in the middle, and at the other extreme you see Latin America and Africa. On the horizontal axis, it's the same story, low emancipation versus high emancipation, which is another name for collectivism versus individualism. And once again, we see that the US is not at the top of the individualism scale. It's not at the top of high emancipation, whether you measure self-reports, values, beliefs, whatever, or practices, the US is not at the top. So I hope that that this and Chris Welzel's studies and all the other studies that debunk this myth will someday convince those who continue to use this flawed Hofstede measure, which puts the US at the top of the individualism scale. Now, there is something interesting and surprising. Kazakhstan and Russia quite low on this scale. Of course, this is, I don't know. There is a subjective element in these measures of political freedom and transparency. Some of you are political scientists. I'm not an expert in this field. I try to find out how they measure these, especially political freedom. It seems that it's quite, countries do not have much political freedom, but this may be a Western prejudice. If you take out political freedom and transparency versus corruption, Russia and Kazakhstan would probably score considerably higher. Just like on the map of self-descriptions, they're not as collectivist as on this map. So there may be some Western subjectivism that explains this very low position of Russia and Kazakhstan. So subjective individualism and objective emancipation, you see an almost perfect alignment, and subjective flexibility and long-term orientation, the alignment is also pretty good. And here I show you the correlations. Flexibility monumentalism correlates with LTO from behaviors, 0.80, almost not at all with emancipation. Vice versa, individualism, collectivism, subjective individualism, collectivism, very strong correlation with objective emancipation, 0.81, very low and insignificant correlation with LTO across 29 countries. This is 39 countries. This is the situation across nations. Now, what about the US? We observe something very similar across the 50 states. Look at emancipation, the first component. Road death tolls, gender equality, percentage attending church weekly, and patents. We do not have a measure of freedom or transparency versus corruption, probably because there are no major differences in freedom across the 50 states, because it's the same country with the same political system. They have measures of corruption, but they measure corruption across the 50 states in terms of convictions, which is very different from the methodology used by Transparency International. So we don't have those measures. And still we have a factor that very much resembles the factor that we extracted in the analysis across nations. And the yellow factor is also very similar. Myopia prevalence by state loads on the same factor as 8th grade math achievement, percentage births to unmarried mothers, pregnancy rates age 15-19, and homicide rates across the 50 states. And this is the cultural